The soft hum of engines filled the cabin as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, searching for their assigned seats. Luggage compartments opened and closed with rhythmic clatters, while the flight attendants moved with practiced precision, assisting travelers and ensuring everything was in order. Near the front, a cheerful flight attendant greeted each passenger with a polite smile. "Good evening. Welcome aboard Flight 217 to New York. Please store your carry-on items in the overhead bins or beneath the seat in front of you." The atmosphere was calm yet bustling, a typical pre-flight scene. Families whispered among themselves, a couple debated over which movie to watch, and a few business people pulled out laptops, already immersed in their work. Amid the crowd, a woman in her late 50s stepped onto the plane, her sharp heels clicking against the floor. Her meticulously styled blonde hair and tailored beige coat gave her an air of sophistication, but her pinched expression hinted at something less welcoming. She clutched her designer handbag tightly as her eyes scanned the seats. With a sigh that carried both impatience and disdain, she adjusted her scarf and began making her way down the aisle. Her sharp gaze darted around, subtly inspecting the passengers she passed. When she finally arrived at her assigned seat, her expression changed, her face stiffened, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Seated beside her was a young black man, perhaps in his late 20s, quietly scrolling through his phone. He wore a simple hoodie and jeans, his demeanor calm and composed. Oblivious to her arrival, he adjusted his earphones and glanced out of the window. The man seemed entirely at peace. His posture was relaxed, his face carried an air of quiet confidence, and there was a warm kindness in his eyes, even as he focused on the world outside. He exuded a quiet strength, the kind that made him stand out, not because he sought attention, but because he was so comfortable in his own skin. It was clear that he wasn't a man of many words. His presence was enough to command respect. The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face, followed by a barely perceptible scowl. "Excuse me," she said sharply, catching the attention of a nearby flight attendant. Her voice was polite but laced with irritation. "Is this seat correct? There must be some mistake." The flight attendant smiled, glancing at her boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am. This is your assigned seat. Is there an issue?" The woman hesitated, her expression tightening. She leaned in closer to the attendant and whispered, "I'd prefer not to sit here. Isn't there another seat available?" The attendant frowned slightly but remained professional. "I'm afraid the flight is nearly full. If you'd like, I can check after boarding is complete." The woman forced a tight-lipped smile and nodded, clearly displeased. She placed her handbag on the seat and sat down gingerly, her movements stiff and deliberate. As she settled in, she made no effort to hide her discomfort, shifting slightly away from the young man and adjusting her scarf as though shielding herself. Her subtle glances in his direction and occasional sighs were enough to convey her unease. The young man finally noticed her presence and offered a polite nod, but she responded with a curt acknowledgment, her lips barely moving. Moments later, as the flight crew announced final boarding calls, the woman muttered under her breath, loud enough to be heard, "They really should consider seating arrangements more carefully." The young man's brow furrowed slightly, but he chose not to respond, instead returning his focus to his phone. Her words hung in the air, unacknowledged but not unnoticed. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances, sensing the tension but saying nothing. The woman, meanwhile, continued to fidget, her body language making it clear that she found the situation unacceptable. The plane had just begun to taxi, the soft voice of the captain announcing their departure. Most passengers settled into their seats, adjusting blankets or flipping through the in-flight entertainment menu. But in row 12, the air was far from calm. The woman shifted in her seat again, her sharp heels tapping lightly against the floor. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, her discomfort visibly increasing with each passing moment. She glanced to her left, where the young black passenger sat, and pursed her lips. Unable to bear her thoughts any longer, she waved at the nearest flight attendant with a dramatic flourish. The young attendant, a cheerful woman in her mid-30s, quickly approached. "Yes, ma'am? Is there something I can help you with?" she asked with a polite smile. The woman leaned in, lowering her voice, though her words were still loud enough to be overheard by nearby passengers. "I think there's been some sort of mistake. I don't feel comfortable sitting here." The attendant's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a professional concern. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there a specific issue with your seat?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to the passenger beside her before returning to the attendant. "Well, I just don't think this seating arrangement is suitable for me." The black passenger, who had been quietly scrolling through his phone, paused. He didn't look up, but his expression tightened ever so slightly, as though he had heard this kind of comment many times before. Still, he said nothing. The flight attendant blinked, clearly unsure how to interpret the woman's vague complaint. "I see. Unfortunately, this is your assigned seat, and the flight is nearly full. If it's a comfort issue, I can bring you a blanket or a pillow?" "No, no," the woman interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "It's not the seat itself, it's—" She trailed off, gesturing subtly toward her seatmate, as if expecting the attendant to understand. The attendant's professionalism wavered slightly as she realized the implication. Her polite smile stiffened. "I'm afraid there's nothing I can do at the moment, ma'am, but if a seat becomes available after takeoff, I'll let you know." The woman sighed heavily, leaning back in her seat with an exaggerated display of frustration. "Fine," she muttered, "but this really isn't ideal." As the plane ascended, the woman's dissatisfaction grew more evident. She adjusted her scarf repeatedly, shifting her body toward the aisle as though trying to create as much distance as possible between herself and her seatmate. Her gestures were subtle but deliberate, pulling her coat closer around her, turning slightly away whenever he moved, and occasionally glancing in his direction with thinly veiled disdain. When the flight attendant returned to offer refreshments, the woman seized the opportunity to make another pointed comment. "Excuse me," she said, her tone overly polite, but edged with condescension. "I'd like a cup of tea, and if you could make sure it's prepared properly. I've noticed standards slipping on flights lately." The attendant nodded and turned to the passenger beside her. "And for you, sir?" The young man looked up with a polite smile. "Just water, please." The woman scoffed quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "Typical," she muttered under her breath. This time he glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. But again he said nothing. The woman's behavior didn't go unnoticed. A middle-aged man across the aisle watched the exchange, his brow furrowed in disapproval. A younger woman seated behind them exchanged a knowing look with her friend, shaking her head slightly. Still, no one said a word. The tension in the air was palpable, but the unspoken rules of public decorum held everyone in place. They watched, uncomfortable but silent, as the woman continued to fidget and sigh. One of her louder sighs drew the attention of a man sitting directly in front of her. He turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder, as though considering saying something, but ultimately decided against it. At one point, the woman turned to her seatmate directly, her tone clipped. "Do you think you could stop moving around so much? It's very distracting." The young man looked at her calmly, his gaze steady but not confrontational. "I wasn't aware I was moving much, ma'am, but I'll try." His voice was soft, even courteous, but there was an unmistakable firmness in his words, a quiet assertion of dignity. The woman blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his composure. "Well," she said after a pause, her tone faltering slightly, "just try to keep it to a minimum." He nodded once and returned to his phone, his expression as neutral as ever. But his restraint only seemed to irritate her further. As the flight progressed, the woman's discomfort showed in small but telling ways. She avoided touching the shared armrest, instead keeping her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She angled her body even farther away, almost leaning into the aisle. Her whispers and muttered remarks, though barely audible, created an invisible divide between her and the young man, a barrier of prejudice that she made no effort to hide. Yet he remained unbothered, his calm presence a quiet rebuke to her hostility. The silent observers in the cabin grew increasingly uneasy. A young couple seated 2 rows ahead whispered to each other, occasionally glancing back. The middle-aged man across the aisle exchanged a brief look with the younger woman behind him, their shared disapproval evident. But no one spoke up. Perhaps it was the setting, a confined plane where a confrontation seemed out of place. Or perhaps it was the subtlety of the woman's actions which skirted the line between rude and overtly offensive. Whatever the reason, the passengers' collective silence hung heavily in the air, a quiet complicity that added to the tension. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines provided a steady background, occasionally interrupted by the flight crew's announcements or the rustle of snack bags. For most passengers, the flight had settled into a routine, but in row 1, the woman shifted in her seat yet again, her frustration evident in her exaggerated movements. She huffed loudly, looking around for a flight attendant. Spotting one nearby, she raised her hand dramatically, her tone sharp. "Excuse me, over here," she called, drawing the attention of several nearby passengers. The attendant approached, her expression cautious. "Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you?" The woman gestured broadly toward her seatmate, her voice rising in pitch. "I've been patient long enough. I already told you I'm uncomfortable sitting here. This situation is unacceptable." The black passenger glanced up briefly, his expression calm but weary, as though this wasn't the first time he had encountered such behavior. He said nothing, choosing instead to return his focus to the book he had started reading. The attendant's smile faltered, and she lowered her voice in an attempt to diffuse the situation. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, the flight is full. I'm afraid we can't move you at this time." "This is ridiculous," the woman snapped, her voice loud enough for several rows to hear. "You expect me to just sit here and put up with this?" The murmurs of nearby passengers began to grow louder. People craned their necks to get a better view of the commotion, some whispering to one another. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned slightly forward, his brow furrowed in annoyance. The young couple 2 rows ahead exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy, the tension palpable. The woman, emboldened by the lack of immediate intervention, continued. "This is just, ugh. Why do airlines insist on cramming us together like this? It's like they don't care about their passengers' comfort anymore." Her tone was pointed, her gaze occasionally flicking toward the young man beside her. Though she never explicitly named him as the source of her discomfort, the implication was clear to everyone within earshot. The black passenger paused, closing his book with deliberate calm. He placed it neatly on the tray table and turned to the woman, his expression composed. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady and respectful, "I don't mean to cause you any discomfort. I'm just sitting in my assigned seat, like everyone else." His tone carried no trace of anger or defensiveness, only quiet dignity. For a brief moment, the woman seemed taken aback, as though she hadn't expected him to respond at all. But her surprise quickly morphed into indignation. "Well, maybe if you weren't so—" She stopped short, glancing around as if realizing the weight of her words. "Never mind," she said instead, crossing her arms tightly. The man across the aisle finally spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I think you should leave him alone. He hasn't done anything to bother you." The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? I wasn't talking to you." "Well, you're certainly making the rest of us uncomfortable," the man replied, leaning back in his seat with an air of finality. A ripple of agreement passed through the nearby rows. The young woman behind them whispered to her friend, "She's unbelievable. Why doesn't she just stop?" The murmurs grew louder, and the woman's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She straightened in her seat, her voice rising once more. "I have every right to express my concerns. This is about my comfort and safety, and I won't be silenced. just because you all disagree." Another flight attendant arrived, alerted by the commotion. He crouched beside the woman's seat, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice. This is a shared space, and we want everyone to have a comfortable flight." "Comfortable?" the woman scoffed, gesturing toward her seatmate. "How am I supposed to be comfortable sitting here? I told your colleague already. I need to be moved." The attendant sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I understand your concerns, but as we've said, there are no other seats available. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, we may have to involve the captain." This mention of authority caused a flicker of hesitation in the woman's expression, but she quickly masked it with indignation. "Oh, please, I'm the one being mistreated here." Through it all, the young man remained quiet, his composure unshaken. But his eyes betrayed a hint of weariness, a silent acknowledgment of the emotional toll such moments could take. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the stares and whispers, yet his expression remained stoic. Inwardly, however, he couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. Why did he always have to be the one to rise above, to stay calm and composed, even in the face of blatant hostility? He took a deep breath, centering himself. He wouldn't let her words define him, not here, not ever. A younger woman, seated 2 rows ahead, finally spoke up, her voice clear and assertive. "Ma'am, you're being incredibly rude. He's done nothing to deserve this treatment." Several heads nodded in agreement, and the murmurs grew louder. The woman's face reddened further, and she seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The man across the aisle chimed in again, this time addressing the passenger directly. "You're handling this better than most of us would. Don't let her get to you." The young man offered a small, appreciative nod, but said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Frustrated and outnumbered, the woman leaned back in her seat with a huff, crossing her arms tightly. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. "This is what happens when you let just anyone board a plane." The cabin fell silent. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, shocking even those who had remained passive until now. The man across the aisle shook his head in disbelief, while the young couple ahead exchanged wide-eyed glances. The black passenger closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. He refused to stoop to her level. Instead, he opened his book once more, turning the page with deliberate calm. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants prepared to serve drinks and snacks. Most passengers had returned to their routines, watching movies, reading, or dozing off. The murmurs of conversation had settled, leaving a quiet hum of activity. But the tension from row 12 lingered, unspoken but palpable. The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her earlier outbursts had drawn glares and whispers from nearby passengers, but she seemed unfazed, or perhaps too proud to acknowledge the growing disapproval around her. Then it happened. It started with a faint cough, barely noticeable above the soft noise of the cabin. The woman cleared her throat, adjusting her scarf as if trying to brush it off. But a moment later, the cough returned, sharper and more insistent. Her face reddened slightly as she reached for her water. The black passenger beside her glanced over, his brow furrowing in concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked calmly, his tone devoid of any trace of the earlier tension. She waved him off with a dismissive gesture, her pride clearly intact. "I'm fine," she rasped, though her voice sounded strained. She sipped the water but coughed again, harder this time. The coughing quickly escalated, drawing attention from nearby passengers. She clutched her chest, her breathing becoming erratic. Her face turned a shade paler, and her eyes darted around in panic. A flight attendant rushed over, alerted by the growing commotion. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked, crouching beside the woman's seat. The woman shook her head, unable to speak, as she gasped for air. "Someone call for medical assistance," the attendant shouted toward the front of the plane. Her voice carried an urgency that sent ripples of unease through the cabin. Passengers began to stir, their earlier disapproval of the woman momentarily forgotten in the face of the emergency. A young woman in the aisle seat leaned forward, whispering to her companion, "What's happening? Is she choking?" The middle-aged man across the aisle stood up slightly, peering over. "Does anyone here know first aid?" he called out, his voice tinged with worry. Another flight attendant appeared, carrying an oxygen mask. She quickly assessed the situation, attempting to calm the panicked woman. "Ma'am, I need you to take deep breaths. Here, use this." But the woman was too far gone into her distress to cooperate fully. Her hands trembled as she reached for the mask, only to fumble with it. The crew exchanged worried glances, realizing the situation was worsening by the second. Passengers leaned into the aisle, their faces a mix of concern and helplessness. Whispers filled the air. "What's wrong with her? Is she having a heart attack? Does anyone know what to do?" Amid the chaos, the black passenger beside her calmly unbuckled his seatbelt. His movements were deliberate, his demeanor steady. He turned to the nearest flight attendant. "I know CPR and first aid. Let me help." The attendant blinked, momentarily stunned by his offer. But the urgency of the situation left no room for hesitation. She nodded quickly, stepping aside to let him take over. "Ma'am," he said softly, addressing the woman as he gently adjusted her position in the seat. "I need you to stay as calm as possible. I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me." Her wide, panicked eyes met his. For a moment, it seemed as though she might resist, pride and prejudice battling with fear. But her need for survival won out. She nodded weakly, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The man worked quickly and methodically, his actions exuding a quiet confidence that reassured the flight crew and passengers alike. He tilted her head slightly to open her airway, carefully monitoring her breathing. "She's struggling to catch her breath," he said to the flight attendant. "Bring the portable defibrillator, just in case." Passengers watched in silence, their earlier judgments now replaced by awe. The middle-aged man across the aisle muttered, "I can't believe it," after everything she said. The young couple, 2 rows ahead, exchanged a look of disbelief. "He's saving her life," one of them whispered, shaking their head. The flight attendant returned with the defibrillator and a first aid kit, assisting the man as he worked. Another crew member made an announcement over the intercom. "If there is a medical professional on board, please make yourself known immediately." A woman from the back of the plane, a nurse, hurried forward, offering to assist. She quickly assessed the situation alongside the black passenger, confirming his actions were correct. Together, they stabilized the woman's condition. Her breathing began to even out, though she remained visibly shaken and weak. As the immediate danger subsided, the woman looked around, her face pale and her expression dazed. Her eyes landed on the man beside her, the very person she had demeaned and dismissed not long ago. You saved me," she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "I did what anyone should do in that situation, ma'am." Her eyes filled with tears, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, shame, perhaps, or the weight of realization. But no words came. She simply stared at him, struggling to process what had just happened. A ripple of applause broke out among the passengers, starting with the middle-aged man across the aisle and spreading throughout the cabin. It was a moment of collective acknowledgment, not just of the man's heroism, but of the humanity he had shown in the face of prejudice. The young woman behind them leaned forward, whispering, "He didn't have to do that, but he did." The flight attendants offered their heartfelt thanks, one of them even placing a comforting hand on the man's shoulder. "You handled that incredibly well," she said softly. "Thank you." The cabin was silent, save for the hum of the engines and the labored breaths of the woman in distress. All eyes were on row 12, where chaos had given way to a remarkable display of calm and courage. The black passenger, who had endured the woman's insults and disdain for the duration of the flight, was now at the center of the unfolding drama, not as a victim, but as a hero. With a steady hand, he adjusted the woman's position in her seat to improve her airflow. Her breaths were shallow and uneven, her panic evident in her darting eyes. "Stay with me," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to help you." He checked her pulse, his actions methodical yet swift, as though he had performed such procedures countless times before. The flight attendant handed him the oxygen mask, which he gently placed over her nose and mouth. "Breathe slowly," he instructed. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." Her trembling hands clutched the armrest, but his presence seemed to anchor her. Despite the fear in her eyes, she followed his instructions, her breaths gradually becoming steadier. Suddenly her body tensed, and her breathing faltered again. Alarmed, he checked her pulse once more. "She's going into respiratory distress," he said to the flight attendant beside him. "We need to act quickly." Without hesitation, he tilted her head back to ensure her airway remained open. "Does anyone have medical training?" he called out, his voice cutting through the tense silence. A nurse from the back of the plane stepped forward, her bag in hand. "I'm a nurse," she said, crouching beside him. "Let me help." Together they worked in tandem, the nurse assisting with the defibrillator while the passenger focused on maintaining her breathing. The cabin watched in stunned silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Minutes stretched on like hours, each second laden with suspense. Then, at last, the woman's breathing stabilized. Her chest rose and fell more evenly, and the tension in her body eased. "She's stable for now," the nurse confirmed, her voice tinged with relief. "We need to keep monitoring her, but you've done an amazing job." The passenger nodded, his own relief evident in the small exhale he allowed himself. He stepped back slightly, giving the nurse space to take over, but remained close enough to assist if needed. The silence in the cabin broke with a collective sigh of relief. The passengers, who had been frozen in their seats, began to react. The middle-aged man across the aisle clapped first, his hands coming together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Others quickly joined in, the applause growing louder and more heartfelt. It wasn't just a gesture of gratitude, it was a recognition of the courage and humanity displayed by the man who had stepped up. "That was incredible," murmured a young woman seated behind them. "He didn't hesitate for a second." A mother seated a few rows ahead whispered to her child, "That's what it means to be a good person." The murmurs of admiration rippled through the cabin, passengers turning to one another to share their awe. "He saved her life," one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "After everything she said, unbelievable." The woman, still weak but conscious, opened her eyes slowly. Her gaze landed on the man who had just saved her, and her expression shifted, confusion giving way to dawning recognition. "You," she began, her voice barely audible. "You helped me?" The man nodded, his face calm but unreadable. "You were in trouble. I did what needed to be done." Her lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed as though she might cry. The weight of her earlier behavior bore down on her, the realization of her prejudice clashing with the gratitude she now felt. She struggled to find the words, her pride and shame warring within her. I don't know what to say," she stammered at last. "You don't need to say anything," he replied simply, his tone kind but firm. "Just focus on getting better." The plane was quiet again, but this time it was a silence filled with reflection. The passengers had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the saving of a life, but a profound act of kindness that transcended the barriers of prejudice. The man returned to his seat, retrieving his book as though nothing unusual had happened. But the glances and whispers around him made it clear that he had left a deep impression on everyone aboard. The middle-aged man across the aisle leaned over. "You're a good man," he said simply, his voice filled with respect. The young couple, 2 rows ahead, exchanged a look. "I hope she realizes how lucky she is," one of them murmured. Even the flight attendants seemed moved, one of them pausing to thank him personally. "What you did back there was extraordinary," she said quietly. "You saved her life." As the flight continued, the woman remained quiet, her earlier indignation replaced by a visible humility. She glanced at the man beside her several times, as though wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. Finally, as the plane prepared for landing, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. I owe you an apology, and my thanks." He looked at her, his expression gentle but firm. "We all make mistakes, ma'am. What matters is what we do after." Her eyes welled with tears, and she nodded. For the first time that flight, she sat in genuine silence, not the silence of disdain, but of introspection. As the plane began its gradual descent, the once tense cabin was now filled with a reflective calm. The earlier chaos of the emergency had subsided, leaving behind a collective sense of awe and introspection. The black passenger sat quietly in his seat, the book he had been reading earlier resting unopened on the tray table. He gazed out the window, the soft glow of the setting sun illuminating his thoughtful expression. Beside him the woman stirred. Her face, pale and tired from the ordeal, bore an expression of deep contemplation. She shifted slightly in her seat, glancing toward him but hesitating to speak. Her pride, so evident earlier, now seemed to weigh heavily on her. The words formed and dissolved in her throat multiple times. How could she articulate the depth of her regret? How could she face the man she had treated so poorly, knowing he had saved her life? She began, her voice barely above a whisper. She stopped, swallowing hard. "I owe you an apology." The man turned his head, his expression calm but unreadable. He said nothing, allowing her the space to continue. "I was wrong," she admitted, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "About everything, about you." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know why I acted the way I did. I'm so ashamed." He waited a moment before responding, his voice steady and kind. "Ma'am, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." His words were free of judgment or anger, carrying instead a quiet wisdom. She looked at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You didn't have to help me," she said, her voice breaking. "After the way I treated you, you had every reason not to." He shook his head gently. "Helping someone in need isn't about what they deserve. It's about doing the right thing." Her tears spilled over and she nodded, her gratitude and remorse evident. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for saving my life." The exchange didn't go unnoticed. Passengers seated nearby had been watching discreetly, their expressions softening as they observed the woman's emotional journey. The middle-aged man across the aisle leaned over, offering a warm smile. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said, directing his comment to both of them. "And it takes even more to respond with kindness." The young couple, seated 2 rows ahead, exchanged a glance, one of them whispering, "I hope she really means it." The murmurs of admiration and reflection spread through the cabin. Some passengers spoke in hushed tones about the earlier events, while others remained quietly reflective, their thoughts turned inward. As the plane descended further, the woman sat back in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She stared straight ahead, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Her earlier behavior replayed in her head, each comment and gesture now laced with regret. She realized that her prejudice had not only hurt others, but had also diminished her own humanity. Her gaze shifted to the man beside her. He had said little since the emergency, but his calm presence spoke volumes. She marveled at his strength, not just his ability to save her life, but his ability to rise above her cruelty with such grace. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. What began as a flight filled with tension and division had transformed into a space of unity and understanding. Passengers who had been hesitant to speak earlier now felt inspired by what they had witnessed. One of the flight attendants paused beside the black passenger's seat, a small smile on her face. "Thank you for what you did back there," she said softly. "You reminded all of us of what it means to be human." He nodded, his response humble. "I just did what anyone should do." Her smile widened slightly. "Maybe, but not everyone would." As the plane touched down, a ripple of applause broke out. It started small, just a few claps from the back of the cabin, but it quickly grew, spreading through the rows. Passengers turned to look at the man, their faces lit with gratitude and admiration. The woman beside him hesitated for a moment before joining in, her claps tentative at first, but growing stronger. Her applause was not just for him, but for the lesson she had learned, a lesson about humility, kindness, and the strength of character. As the plane taxied to the gate, the woman turned to the man one last time. "I'll never forget this," she said softly, "and I'll do better, I promise." He offered her a small smile, his eyes kind. "That's all anyone can ask." As the passengers disembarked, many lingered to offer their thanks to the man, their words filled with admiration. The young woman who had spoken up earlier gave him a thumbs up as she passed. "You're a better person than most of us," she said, smiling. The woman walked off the plane slowly, her steps thoughtful. She carried with her not just the gratitude of having her life saved, but a newfound resolve to change. The soft glow of airport lights filled the cabin as passengers gathered their belongings and filed into the aisles. The hum of conversation was quieter now, tinged with an unspoken acknowledgment of the events that had unfolded during the flight. The story of the black passenger's heroism and the woman's transformation lingered in the air, a silent reminder of the power of humanity. As the plane emptied, the flight attendants stood at the exit, bidding farewell to the passengers. When the black passenger approached, one of them paused, her smile warm and genuine. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "Not just for what you did back there, but for how you handled everything. You've inspired us all." He nodded, his humility unwavering. "Take care," he replied simply, stepping into the jet bridge. The woman followed behind him, her steps slower, her head bowed slightly. As she passed the flight attendants, they offered her a kind but knowing smile, a silent encouragement that she was on a better path now. As the screen transitions to the final moments, a voiceover begins, carrying the story's powerful message. In a world where differences often divide us, it's acts of kindness and humanity that remind us of what truly matters. This is more than a story about a passenger saving a life. It's a testament to the strength of character, the courage to rise above prejudice, and the importance of treating others with respect, no matter their background. The voiceover pauses as images of diverse people from all walks of life flash on the screen, smiling faces, hands helping one another, and communities coming together. Racism and prejudice are not just words, they are actions that harm individuals and fracture societies. But just as hatred can divide, kindness has the power to heal. The voiceover continues, inviting the audience to reflect on their own lives. Ask yourself, how often do we judge others based on assumptions or stereotypes? How often do we fail to stand up when we see someone treated unfairly? It's in these moments that we have the chance to choose compassion over indifference, understanding over ignorance. Text appears on the screen, bold and impactful. The words linger for a moment before fading into an image of two hands clasped together, one black, one white, a universal symbol of unity and hope. The narrative shifts, encouraging viewers to take tangible steps toward change. Change begins with awareness, but it doesn't end there. Speak up when you see injustice. Listen to those whose experiences differ from your own. And most importantly, treat every person you encounter with the dignity and respect they deserve. The screen transitions to a closing slide with text that reads, "Be the reason someone believes in the goodness of humanity." Below the text, A small prompt encourages further engagement. Share this story, reflect on your actions, and make a difference in your community. The scene shifts back to the terminal, where the black passenger walks quietly toward the baggage claim. The woman watches him from a distance, a look of determination on her face. She takes a deep breath and steps forward, catching up to him. "Excuse me," she says, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you again, and I'm sorry. Truly." He turns to her, his expression kind but measured. "I appreciate that," he replies. "Take care of yourself." She nods, a small but genuine smile breaking through her tears. As he walks away, she stands still, the weight of her experiences settling into a newfound resolve. The story ends with a voiceover summarizing the key takeaway. We are not defined by the prejudices we face or the mistakes we make. We are defined by how we rise above them, how we grow, and how we choose to treat others. This is the power of humanity, the ability to heal, to forgive, and to build a better world together. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with one final message. Be kind, be human, be better.